Okay, so we're back with our discussion of ethics, and we have been talking about uh, what moral judgments mean. So when you say something is right, something is wrong, what does that mean in the first place? So that's metaethics. That's a topic of metaethics because it's the study of about ethics. It's like what ethics, ethical claims mean, uh, and so on. So in this part, we're going to be talking about normative ethics. And so this is the question of what is actually right or wrong. And, there's obviously a very long discussion in the history of philosophy about normative ethics. And we're going to be looking at some of the major views. What's interesting about this topic is that almost everybody has some sort of opinion about this issue, and hopefully the discussions here will be helpful in for you to develop your own views about morality. We can't really escape morality. We make judgments about right or wrong all the time, and they help us guide our lives. So philosophers have quite a lot to say about this. So let's get started. Um, let's start with some non-starter views, and so that is views that sort of you often sort of hear people use these ethical views, but they're not to be taken seriously. But let's just sort of like cover these. So one view might be that the right action. What is the right? What should you do? What's the right action? The right action is one that is natural, and the wrong act is one that is not natural. Okay, so um, uh, for example, you might think that you know dressing up like a robot and going out and to a middle of a restaurant and eating coins, you might think that's wrong and it's just not natural. It's not natural to do that. You might think that's wrong. It's kind of a silly example, but you often hear people actually use the non-natural natural distinction to um, say that, for instance, homosexuality is wrong. So people will say, it's just not natural, or bestiality, which is like sex with animals. We think that's not natural, and so that's an explanation that people give for why those things are thought to be wrong. It's interesting that you might think those things are wrong for other reasons. So that those are if you think those things are wrong, they need not follow from the fact that they're not natural. Okay, so let's just look at. I mean, so the major. I mean, it's pretty easy to see that these are really not very serious views. So take for instance the use of cell phones or medical technology, X-rays. These things are not natural, but obviously intuitively these things it's morally okay to use medicine to help your dying child, say. um, on the other side, you might think that some types of violence are natural. So you might think that we are humans are sort of designed to respond in this emotional way to various offenses. And say, for instance, if you catch somebody cheating, so if you catch your spouse cheating on you, you might get really upset about this. You might kill your spouse. You might kill the other person, and so you might think, in some sense, this is a natural thing, but obviously it would still be wrong to do that. I'm not talking about cases of self-defense. I'm just talking about cases where you just get very emotional, passionate, and then you just kill people because of it. And it just seems clearly wrong, but maybe natural. And so it's pretty clear then that the sort of natural view of what's right and wrong is itself not a starter, is not really taken seriously by people who thought about these issues for a while. So Another non-starter view is a type of egoism where the right action for a person is just one that benefits you the most. So you might think, what's the right thing to do in this case? Well, it's the thing that benefits the most. So benefits me the most. So um, is it right for me to take job X over job Y? What's the right thing to do? Well, which one's going to benefit me the most? That's the right thing to do. And so, according to this view, you just follow your own, what matters to you, and then you make a decision based on that. Again, this view is just obviously a non starter. So, there are many things that are horrific and very bad that would be in the self interest in the person in power to actually start. So, genocide, slavery, war. I mean, suppose you just have somebody in power who can make these things happen. It's not hard to come up with scenarios in which these things would benefit them. In fact, in history, you see many cases like this. But of course, it doesn't follow automatically that it is right to do these things, genocide, slavery, and war, just because it benefits the person in power. Right? So this is just a pretty knockdown case of why it's wrong, why egoism and the various versions of egoism, lots of versions of it are wrong. Okay, so let's just get into a more sort of serious, influential theory in normative ethics, which is called utilitarianism. You might have heard of it. And just again, a reminder that we're now in the sphere of normative ethics and not meta ethics. And so we're talking about theories which tell us, what the right thing to do is, what is valuable, what ought we do, as opposed to what moral judgments actually mean. So a bit of history. So the early advocates of the theory include Bentham and Mill. And utilitarianism actually played an important role in political thinking in both Britain and the USA in the 19th century. And it continues to be of major interest to philosophers of political theories. So utilitarianism tells you first of all, what is intrinsically valuable. So you might be interested in what is it that is intrinsically valuable? It's pleasure or happiness. That is the only thing, actually, according to them, that has intrinsic value, positive value. And in contrast, what has disvalue or disutility is pain and suffering. Okay. Now, it's important to realize that according to utilitarianism, happiness and pleasure are not just bodily pleasure. So we're not just talking about the feeling that you get when you go on a roller coaster or when you eat something tasty or you have good sex. You're also talking about other types of pleasure. There are other types of pleasure, like for instance, the pleasure you might get from having good friends or seeing your family members flourish, listening to good music, or writing a poem, writing a book, discovering a scientific fact, writing a wonderful term paper for your class, acing your exam, helping somebody. These all count as intrinsic pleasures. Okay. So, and as I said, the opposite would be things that give you disutility, which are pain and unhappiness, which are intrinsically disvalued. Okay, so I've talked about intrinsic pleasure or intrinsic happiness versus, and now I want to distinguish that with this notion of instrumental value. So something can be intrinsically valued versus instrumentally valued. Something that's intrinsically valued is something that is valued for its own sake. And something that is valued instrumentally is valued because it leads to something else which is intrinsically valued. Right? So utilitarians acknowledge that there are many things can be instrumentally valued, but they're instrumentally valued because they lead to things that are intrinsically valued, which is just pain, which is happiness, for example. Right. So just to give you an example, so why would going to the dentist? Why is it valuable to go to the dentist? So it's what the utilitarian would say is that, well, it's not intrinsically valued because going to the dentist is kind of a painful experience, but it's instrumentally valuable. Why is that? Because it will lead to, although it'll be like painful in the short term, it will lead to in the future pleasure and happiness. Okay, so in itself, intrinsically, going to the dentist is not valuable for the average person, but people go to it and people still value it, and they value it instrumentally because or indirectly because in the future it will lead to greater happiness and pleasure because you won't have toothaches. Okay, so what is the utilitarian principle? So what do they recommend that you do when you're facing a moral or you're facing a decision? Okay, so the principle is this: we should act as to bring about the maximum amount of pleasure or happiness in the long run. Okay, so and this is a type of act utilitarianism, and we're going to distinguish that from rule utilitarianism. We'll go back later, right? So we'll go back later to talk about rule utilitarianism. So according to act utilitarianism, you're going to act so as to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay, so now it's important to realize that this is not immediate happiness. So this is happiness in the long run. So overall happiness. So the utilitarian says, you're trying to decide what to do the thing that's going to maximize the happiness or the pleasure in the world overall, in the long run. Okay, and so we gave example of going to the dentist. Going to the dentist is the right thing to do according to utilitarian because it's going to bring you, even though it's going to bring you short-term unhappiness, it's going to bring you happiness and pleasure in the long run. Okay. You might think also going to war sometimes is justified according to utilitarian because although people will be sacrificed, people will die, and maybe innocent people will die, it'll create the greatest number of, the greatest amount of happiness and pleasure in the world in the long run. Okay, so sometimes, of course, it can be very difficult to know what will maximize happiness in the long run. So utilitarians are not saying that they have a recipe that will be easily applied in every circumstance. Okay. So so sort of just like you don't expect medicine to have a cure-all pill for all diseases, you don't expect a ethical theory to just give you some theory which will give you a clear answer for every question. So you can think about various situations and think about in history and think about what the utilitarian would predict about these cases. So going into World War II, invading Iraq, the decision to drop atomic bombs in Japan. Now here's some important things about utilitarianism. So when calculating the amount of happiness or pleasure that an action will bring about, the utilitarians insist that everyone's happiness should be counted equally. Equally. So it's not like your happiness counts more than my happiness. Everybody's happiness counts equally. So the king's happiness is going to count the same as the happiness of the beggar. And no racism, right? So then the white person's happiness counts the same as a black person's happiness. And no sexism. The happiness of a man counts the same as the happiness for a woman. And you can say, this is actually kind of a radical view for 19th century political life, right? So everyone's happiness counts the same. It's kind of a radical egalitarian type view. And here's the hard part is you're supposed to, when you make your calculation, you're supposed to actually count other people's happiness, right, to the same degree as you count yours. So other people's happiness is equal to your happiness. So it's a type of impartiality according to utilitarianism. Okay, so there's an important parallel here, I think, between utilitarian ethics and Christian doctrine that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself.